Any questions? Hope everybody had a great weekend, prepared for the windstorm that's about to descend on us. That's just not my lecture. It's, the next couple days. Any questions? We're pretty good? We feel comfortable with nitrogen and sulfur. Today we're going to be talking about phosphorus and potassium. And they're going to be the last two nutrients that we're going to be talking about. And I'm continuing to progress from the most extreme biologically mitigated, extreme, that's probably not the right word, the most, I don't know, we're venting already. In essence, I'm going to say most extreme, but the most extreme of the biologically mitigated processes, nutrient cycling, to potassium, which when we start talking about it, there's actually no microbial mediation whatsoever. There's literally no biological mitigation whatsoever. So let's start with phosphorus here. Okay, phosphorus is another macronutrient. It's basically essential for ATP, RNA, and DNA, so for our replication as well as for energy. It's an essential element of cell membranes. This is the hydrophobic issue. Yet still only 0.02 to 0.04 of leaves and approximately 2% of dry matter have this in it. So while it is a macronutrient and it's essential for a lot of different things, there's actually not that much of it that's in our biomass. You've seen slides like this before, but let's talk about where that phosphorus is. Ocean and ocean sediments seem to be the really dominant here. Basically, it's stuff that's sitting at the bottom of the ocean. There's some that's in the water column dissolved, and then in organic and detritus biota that's actually sitting in the ocean or swimming in the ocean. From a land perspective, there's the dominant pool of it is the soil itself. It's in the soil. Okay. There's also a sizable portion of mineral rock. This is basically where we get phosphorus for fertilizer, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. There's the pool of us as well, the biota, and then there's in the freshwater in the terrestrial system. I shouldn't say terrestrial system, but in the upland systems, not oceanic. So there is a pool of it in the freshwater. If you think about this from a soil's perspective and a plant's perspective and our perspective, this pool right up here is what we're managing for. Okay, so what do these pools look like, and what are the fluxes between them? Atmospheric has a very small component. We're really looking at this really large pool that's sitting in the sediments of the ocean right here, and you're basically looking at the dissolved, the biota, and the detrital material basically ultimately ending up here. There's not a lot of feedback from here this way. Yes, there's some going up into the atmosphere, and yes, we dredge materials all the time, but there's just not enough of this moving this way to recharge the phosphorus pools up here. Okay, most of the pools that we see here, actually let me take a step back. In a time scale that's biological. In a geologic sense, all of this stuff is going to be going back into rocks. Okay, and literally it will come right back up here. But that's a geological time scale versus a biological time scale. Okay, so for where we're looking at, we're basically looking at the phosphorus that's in this pool right here, which is in the soil. Yes, there's some coming from mineable rocks, and we're using this basically as our fertilizer. We're digging this up and applying it as fertilizer. This pool is in the biota through humans, and then ultimately it gets into the fresh water or through erosion and ends up into the ocean. Okay? Seems pretty straightforward. Yeah, questions about it? Okay, what we're going to be talking about is really sort of these fluxes, and we're going to be mostly focusing on this component of this cycle. Okay, so those sources and the sinks. The sources, the parent materials are primarily apatite minerals, but there's some other parent materials. The phosphorus ranges are from 0.01 to 0.2%. Okay, so fairly low concentrations. Now, remember when I talked about those leaves, in a sense, yeah, this is low concentrations, but we don't actually need a lot of it for our biomass. Okay? The native soil concentrations, on the other hand, are 200 to 2,000 micrograms per gram, significantly larger than what's in the mineral rock. Okay? We also have it coming in as fertilizer and manures. Basically 10 to 15% of the fertilizers of this phosphorus is coming in as fertilizer is taken up by plants. Okay, so of that efficiency, if we're adding fertilizer onto the system, basically 10 to 15% of what we're adding actually makes it to the plants. Okay, so where does that rest of that stuff go? If we look at the soil pool itself, here I put this slide out here again so you guys can see this number, these numbers. The soil, the amount of phosphorus that's available for bioactivity is actually rather small. Yes, the soil pool is rather large, but of that pool, a very small amount is actually available for plants, and we'll talk for organisms in general, plants in specific, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The bulk is in basically 3 pools, and those pools are an organic phosphorus bound pool, a calcium-bound inorganic pool that tends to be at the higher pHs, and an iron and aluminum-bound inorganic phosphorus which tends to be at the lower pHs. This scale that you see here, or this graph that you see here, this is the extent of phosphorus retention in the soil, okay? And this is the pHs, okay? So we're looking at low pHs here, high pHs here, so alkaline soil versus acidic soils. Okay, you'll look at this pool right here, this bar graph right here. This basically means the sorption of phosphorus with iron and aluminum. Okay, so that is this pool right here. Okay, as the pHs rise, we start seeing the binding with calcium. Okay, so we have calcium phosphate bonds, bound phosphorus. Now it turns out that both of these pools are basically insoluble, which means in essence they're unavailable for biological uptake. Okay, they're not going to go into soil solution all that easily. It does, but it's basically sitting in the soil in an insoluble form. Okay, now there is another pool, and that's this organic phosphorus pool, and that's bound, that's actually throughout this. I mean, there's organic molecules throughout. It doesn't matter what the pH range is, but that phosphorus is also pretty much unavailable for plants, for organisms. Now to take a look at that a little bit better, this is that distribution. I've blown this, the last slide, this is from your book, but that last slide I've basically blown it up into a different slide. I've taken this slide from the book, and what you're looking at here is on this axis, you're looking at the distribution of phosphorus. Okay, here's the soil pH, okay, and here is the distribution of phosphorus at the lower pHs in those iron and aluminum oxides. Okay, there's basically these, and they're insoluble and they're unavailable. Okay, at the high pHs, we're looking at that calcium pool. Okay, and if you look at this, there's a very relatively small range of phosphorus that's available, and it's centered around that pH of 6.5. Okay, small pool. So going back to this slide right up here, the soil, there's a good chunk of phosphorus in the soil. But just because it's in the soil doesn't necessarily mean it's available for the plants. And that's where we see this slide. Okay, of that 100%, if you're down at the pHs of 4, a very, very small portion of that is available. Most of it is bound and unavailable. All right, so let's take a look at the soil surfaces across the United States. Phosphorus in the soil, not only do we have this issue that most of it's bound, okay, but we also have a potential issue of where it is in that distribution. So we look at sort of the coastal plains in the southeast, and then moving up into the northeast, you're looking at fairly low levels of phosphorus that are in the soil. Okay, as you move west, because of the primary minerals, apatites primarily, and the younger rocks that we have out west, we tend to see much more of the phosphorus in those soils. Now, having said that, there are 2 primary mineable areas of the United States where we get phosphorus. One of them happens to be in Florida. We're basically mining rock phosphate. Now, this is, in essence, this is a non-renewable resource, and you saw how little of that pool, if we look at the mineable rock versus soil, there's a very small pool of phosphorus that are in those rocks compared to all the other phosphorus pools. Okay? Now, looking at the soil component of it, remember I want to talk just about the soil component, Okay, here's the soil solution. Okay, organisms basically and organically bound phosphorus. Here's two different pools of the calcium bound phosphorus. This is the calcium bound phosphorus, and this is the iron aluminum bound phosphorus. Okay, plant material, fertilizer, and the biomass. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, and we're going to start with the soil solution. Okay, now from the soil solution, the phosphorus can get into the plants. Okay. Yeah. I don't think I showed a slide yet. Yeah, I need to make a point, and I forgot that. I should have said this earlier. When we talk about phosphorus uptake by plants, it's important to note that plants can only take, well, it's primarily plants can take it up as an inorganic form. The organic form is basically unavailable. Okay, so for plants to be able to access phosphorus, it primarily has to be in an inorganic form. And that's what I'm showing on this slide, and I'll talk about this slide later. But what I want you to see here with this slide is these are those inorganic forms that the plants can take up. Okay, now depending upon what the pH is, that form is going to be changing. Okay, now keep that in mind when I go back, and I'll come back to this slide in a second. Okay, but keep that in mind that the phosphorus has to be in a specific form for the plants to take it up when we look at this graphic. Okay, so that inorganic phosphorus, and that's why I took the slide, I shifted here. I didn't realize the slide had not said that. But that inorganic phosphorus in that soil solution is available for the plants. Okay, now the inorganic phosphorus is also available for the soil or other soil organisms. Okay, microbial populations. Okay, they are immobilizing it. The plants are taking it up and essentially immobilizing it as well. All right? Okay, now this biomass and this biomass, both of these biomasses can die. We can harvest it. We can do whatever we can uptake it into higher trophic levels. Okay, but sooner or later, those organisms are going to die. Okay, which means that phosphorus is now, or because it's been immobilized, that phosphorus is now in organic form, okay? And it comes down as a residue. This material can be decomposed, and in the decomposition of this material, it can be mineralized back into the soil solution. Does that make sense? Now, it turns out a lot of this phosphorus in this organic material is also unavailable because it doesn't decompose, or it has slower rates of decomposition. Okay, and so I have a large pool that is basically bound of phosphorus that's basically bound with organic material that is not available for plant uptake. Remember, it has to be in that inorganic phase to be taken up. Now, once it gets in the soil solution, yes, it can be taken up, but other things can happen to it. And this depends primarily upon the pH. If it is a high pH, okay, this phosphate can bind with calcium, okay? And if it binds in these calcium, it's pretty much unavailable. Now, having said that, it is possible through cation exchange capacity and through decomposition processes for this stuff to actually go back into the solution. But if you look at the size of these arrows, most of this material is going into the calcium-bound pool and basically becoming unavailable. Does that make sense? Now at low pH, it's the same thing will happen, but it will be bound with aluminum and iron. Some of this can be desorbed and put back into the solution, but most of it is going into these pools down here and basically being unavailable to the plants. Okay, questions? Go.
Is it ever the case where there's not enough calcium in the soil
So the question was, is it ever the case where there's not enough calcium in the soil for the phosphorus to bind to? And the answer is yes. Okay? And the answer is yes for two reasons. One is it can be because of a pH issue, where the pH is just low enough, there's not enough calcium. But another issue is where we could be loading so much phosphorus into the system that the calcium, while there is plenty of calcium there, there's not enough calcium to take the load that we're forcing on the system. And that we see a lot of that around here when we start looking at cow and manure operations. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay? Now, having said that, one of the primary sources of us getting phosphorus in the soil, if our phosphorus is in either of these two pools or this pool, it's in the soil, we've got plenty of phosphorus there, but it's unavailable to the plants. So we need to have a way of getting that available to the plants. Conventional agriculture basically says, well, we're going to add some more of this phosphorus. And the reality is that some of this is desorbing. So there is some phosphorus going that way. And what I can do is if I add enough of this, yes, I'm going to be driving the system this way, but I'm going to have some going that way. And if I have some going that way, it means my plants can take it up. Okay, does that make sense? Lily?
When you get a soil test back, what type of phosphorus is it measured?
When you get a test back, they're also going to be doing pH. And so they're going to figure out what the phosphorus is that's available for your plant. They're not going to be doing total phosphorus numbers. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions? Do we feel comfortable with this? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So once again, this question, if we're talking about this, we're talking about trying to see what's going on in here, we need to have a fairly good understanding of what's controlling these fluxes, because that's what's controlling putting this phosphorus in the soil solution. If we're thinking about this from soil fertility for plants, we need to have an understanding about what is forcing mineralization or desorption here. Okay? This is not mineralization. This is already in a mineral form. Okay? It's just because it's bound to calcium or aluminum iron, it's in a mineral form that's not available for the plants. So we have to have an understanding what's going on with those fluxes. All right. So you've seen this slide before. The question is, what's controlling these fluxes and these reactions? Okay? And this is where we get to this slide. Okay? Now, again, biological uptake is primarily in this inorganic form, though some organic P can be taken up. Okay? Phosphorus in the soil solutions range from these very small numbers down here. Okay? So what is it that's driving this reaction? Okay? And it has a lot to do with how the phosphate, what's the ionic form of that phosphate. At high pHs, 10s, 12s, we're looking at HPO4 minus 2. Minus 2 sound, okay? If we start raising it up more calcium is binding in the system, PO3, minus 3. As we move down, we're looking at H2PO4, or PO4, and then ultimately we're back, when we're really low, we're basically looking at phosphoric acid. Okay, these are the forms of those ions that are in solution. These are the forms that are reacting with the calcium, the iron, and the aluminum. Turns out that right around here, at this point right in here, the phosphorus is most available for the plants because it's the least available for binding with calcium and aluminum and iron. Does that make sense? So it's really, generally we think, well, it's the most available. The reality is it's the most available because it's the least available to react with calcium and aluminum and iron. Okay? Good? All right. Which brings us right back to this. Okay? Now, let me stop here. Do we feel comfortable with this? All right, so we have the idea of what the cycle is, and we have an idea about controlling the fluxes. Okay, so then let's take the next step. What are the issues of soil fertility when we start talking about phosphorus, and what are the issues of environmental quality? Now, I haven't asked these questions when I talked about nitrogen or sulfur. Okay, I'm going to introduce it now, though. Issues of soil fertility when you're talking about phosphorus, well, first off, we have low native concentrations. So what does that mean for my plants? Now, if it's not the limiting nutrient, it doesn't really mean that much. But if it is the limiting nutrient, what does that mean? Do you guys understand what I mean by the limiting nutrient? Okay, limiting nutrient, the limiting factor, whatever that limiting factor is, it's the primary limitation on the plant's growth, on any kind of organism's growth. So if it's the limiting factor, it means in this case, if it's phosphorus, phosphorus is what is limiting the potential for that plant to grow further. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? It could be water. It could be sunlight. Okay? In this case, let's imagine it's phosphorus. Okay? If phosphorus is the limiting agent, and we have low concentrations in our soil, what can we do to increase its availability? The first one, and the most obvious one, is changing the pH. Okay, what pH range are these nutrients most available, or is phosphorus most available? 6.5. So if I push it towards 6.5, I'm going to reduce the amount of phosphorus that's being bound to either calcium or iron and aluminum. I'm going to put it into an inorganic form so the plants can take it up. Strategy number one. Another strategy? Add more. Okay? The fertilizer route. I can take that apatite, the rock phosphate, grind it up, and I can throw it in my soils. Yes, I'm going to get a significant amount of it moving into either here or here, depending upon my pH, but I will get some moving into the soil solution, which means it's now potentially available for the plants. Right? What else? What?
Grow crops that need less of it.
That's actually a good strategy. I didn't think about that one. But one thing I could do is I could grow crops that use less phosphorus. And that's certainly possible. The last strategy I would think of was where I would think about where these pools are. Julio, did you have a question? No. Well, where are these pools? These pools are basically unavailable. I could add this as rock phosphate. That's one strategy. Theoretically, I guess I could be adding it like this as well. When I get into this, I'm looking at low pHs, so I'm having other kinds of stresses. Okay? What are the other pools? The microorganisms and the plants themselves, right? So when these things start dying, potentially I could be putting this stuff and adding this as a fertilizer with the understanding that some of this stuff is going to get captured here. I'm basically going to be doing the same thing as I'm doing here, but I'm going to be doing it at this end. I'm going to be adding organic matter. In general, the thought is that most of that stuff is going to be going this way, but some of this is going to be going this way. And if you notice the arrows here, which is the darker arrow? This way. Unlike these guys where it's going this way. So there's a large likelihood that if I'm bringing in stuff this way, much of that's going to be going that way. Any other strategies? Okay, so we can raise the pH. We can go with amendments here or amendments here. We can go with plant selection. Any other thoughts? What? Bioaccumulators. But bioaccumulators would basically put it into there. But there, I mean, this is pie in the sky, but theoretically, the stuff that's in the soil solution, the plant's going to get some of it. Some of it's going to be lost. But if I have a plant that's a lot more efficient at harvesting, whatever that happens to be, it might have to bring in a lot more water because most of this stuff is moving towards the plant through the currents of the water because as the plant respires, it's sucking water in, and that water is bringing the nutrients to it, looking at those concentration gradients. So, I mean, if I did that, I probably would start seeing, I'd have to have plants that could harvest a lot more water, which means then I have to start thinking about potential drought stresses and things like that. But, that's potential there. Any other thoughts? So make the calcium less available. It's possible, but then you run into the issue of calcium also needs to be taken up. So maybe. Go.
I don't know if this is correct, but doesn't buckwheat fix phosphorus?
Buckwheat fixing phosphorus.
I'm not sure.
I haven't heard. You may be right. I haven't heard that. Nitrogen is usually what we think of as phosphorus fixation, unless you're talking about this issue of sort of biomass. It's a different use of the word fixation.
Maybe, yeah. I've heard it before, but
I'll look that one up. I haven't heard that. But all right. So let's think about these other two. If it's local native concentration and it's mostly in these unavailable forms, the soluble forms can in fact be turned quickly insoluble because of the calcium and aluminum. So what does that make us think of? We really have to, makes me think of, I should say. What does it make me think of? It makes me think of that we really have to be conscious about our management of phosphorus, because of phosphorus is not like nitrogen where you can just sort of cycle it through, and it has multiple forms that can be put into plants, and it's always pretty much available in the cycle. Okay? If nitrogen, suddenly there's a pool in the nitrogen that got sucked into something that was totally unavailable, that would be a significant problem, because nitrogen usually is the limiting nutrient. In this case, it's not that, I hesitate to say this, but in this case it's not that big of a deal, because phosphorus usually isn't the limiting nutrient. It's something else. But phosphorus can be the limiting nutrient, and if that's the case, you have to think about these. All right, let's talk about issues of environmental quality. Okay, due to low phosphorus supply in humid and subhuman regions, there's increasing intensity of slash and burn agriculture. Okay, this flies in the face of what I just said. If nitrogen is usually the limiting nutrient, why do we have issues with phosphorus? Well, in certain parts of the world, because of the nature of the soils, there isn't a lot of phosphorus in the soils, and suddenly phosphorus does become the limiting nutrient. So, why are we seeing an increased intensity of slash and burn agriculture? Go right back to this slide. Where are the pools? Okay? If I don't have these two pools and there's not a lot of organic matter in the soil, where's my phosphorus pool? It's up there. And if I want to make it available here so I can get this to go to other types of plants that I want to harvest, I need to take that and I need to put it into this so that I can get that. I cut this down, I burn it, increase this rate, put it in here, and I put it into the plants that I want. Now the reality is a lot of that stuff is going to be blown off, and I'm also going to get leaching, but I am going to get some of this phosphorus into my plants. So I do see a performance increase by slashing and burning in my desired crop. Now, does anybody see a problem with that? Does anybody see a problem with that? It won't last. Okay, you see the problem. It won't last long. Why? I'm obviously asking the wrong questions in this class. Why is this a problem? It's worked for millennia, and it's been very effective, and it's not necessarily been a bad thing. Why is it a problem now?
Agriculture is more intense now, so there's not enough time for regrowth.
It's what is this increase? So the question is, what does this increased intensity actually mean? So that intensity could mean extensive intensity, but in general it also means more frequent intensity. Okay? If you leave your crops, your trees there for a long enough period, 20 or 30 years before you start cutting them and burning them again, there's enough time in that period for the phosphorus in the trees to be made up, and then there's enough time in there for the phosphorus to be taken up by the trees and to be built up. Okay? And then I can cut it, I can burn it, and I can grow crops for a couple years, and then I let it go, basically abandon it, okay, for a couple years, for a couple decades in this case. But what's happening now is that period of abandonment is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, which means the crops, the plants that are there during abandonment do not have enough time to take that phosphorus up, to build up the amount of phosphorus that's actually needed for the targeted crops that you're going to be growing from the swidden material. Okay, you basically cut it, you burn it, you let that ash sit in the soil. The plants then harvest the material that's in that ash. Okay, well, if there isn't material in that ash, or if there isn't enough phosphorus in that ash, your crops that you're growing in that swidden material aren't going to be successful. Does that make sense? Okay, so another big issue is that P deficiencies will often inhibit nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen primarily is that most limiting nutrient, but if I don't have enough phosphorus, I can't fix the nitrogen to overcome that deficit. So a secondary effect. I've got P deficiencies, and now, because I have the P deficiencies, I'm going to have even more nitrogen fixation issues. I'm going to have more nitrogen deficiencies. All right. Another big one, and that's a big one around here, is that P is the limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, not nitrogen. Nitrogen is usually the limiting nutrient in terrestrial systems. In aquatic systems, freshwater aquatic systems, not marine, but in freshwater aquatic systems, phosphorus is usually the limiting nutrient. So what happens when that phosphorus gets into those streams? We have eutrophication. Okay? Now, well before your time and pretty much before my time, phosphorus, there used to be a lot of phosphorus in laundry detergent. It was a cleaning agent. They used it basically as a flocculant to get the dirt off of make it easier for the soap to take dirt off of clothes. And they used to have lots and lots of phosphorus in these laundry detergents. Well, if I put this laundry detergent in my laundry, where's that water, where's that phosphorus going to ultimately end up? In the river and the terrestrial systems. And as a result, you get eutrophication. Now, does everybody know what eutrophication is? Eutrophication is enrichment, which results usually in some sort of algae, some biological bloom, usually algae. Okay? The algae grows exponentially, and then it dies. And as it dies, it sinks down to the bottom, and what happens? Well, it starts decomposing. And if it decomposes and I have lots of food sources down there, what's going to happen to the oxygen levels in the water column? Dramatically decrease, which means all the organisms that need oxygen are going to die. They're going to migrate or they're going to die. Okay? Which is the next phase. Then we start having dead fish. They sit in the system. They start decomposing. And it's just, I'm making the system even more anaerobic. So in essence, I'm killing a system, all because I fertilized the system. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's take this to the next level, and let's actually think about an agricultural system. Okay? This is a forested watershed. This is an agricultural watershed. We're looking at the organic phosphorus. We're looking at different P's here, P pools. This is the organic pool, this big green one here. This white one is the inorganic. Okay? You'll notice that the phosphorus pool in the forested system that is the largest is the organic phosphorus pool. Okay? The smaller is in the agricultural system. All right, so the question is why? Why would we see this be a larger pool than this? More biomass. Okay, in this system, I have much more biomass. It's not to say that I don't have biomass here, but generally in forested systems, there's more trees. There's more biomass per acre. Okay, now, look at these two pools. The inorganic pool. Why is this pool so much larger? Actually, let me take a step. Let's go back. Why is this pool so much smaller? The same question, but a different perspective. This one has the fertilizer. Okay, we're adding fertilizer. We're making this pool very large so that we can maximize the amount of mineralization of phosphorus that's available. The reality is most of this fertilizer is not going to be available for the plants, but because I'm just putting so much of it in, some of it's going to go. Right? We have some inputs here, primarily weathering. Okay? Most of that weathering material is basically staying there because it's slowly being released. If it's slowly being released, the organic matter has a chance to capture it before it's lost from the system. Now granted, this stuff will die and potentially put it back in, okay, either through precipitation or through mineralization. But because these rates are so slow, the phosphorus is being lost from the system. Very tight systems. Okay? This system, on the other hand, is very leaky. Yes, I'm still getting the same amount because I have biomass that is being cycled so much faster, these fluxes are a lot larger, okay? Because I'm still getting the weathering, because I'm getting more fertilizer, I'm putting so much inorganic P, available P, for plant uptake, but because there's so much more of it, I'm going to be losing a lot of it. Okay? Not all of this is going to be going into those forms that are unavailable. I'm just putting so much in this system. Now, why am I seeing these huge fluxes? Or I should say these huge losses. Yes, if I throw this fertilizer in here, supposedly it should be binding with the calcium and or aluminum iron. Shouldn't it? Okay, yes, some of it's going to be available, and I'm going to lose some of it. But look at the size of these losses. What's going on? And this goes back to a question that came earlier. The question of, are there scenarios where there's just not enough calcium to bind? Okay? Now this is a slide from your book. Okay, this slide right here. Okay? Now, let's take a look at this slide right here first, actually. Okay, these are soils, and there are 3 different soils, and we're basically looking at phosphorus levels in these 3 different soils. The dark green soil is a native soil. Imagine it being a forested soil. The dashed green, solid green line here is basically pasture area. Like a cows, like organisms, ungulates grazing. The dotted line right here is basically an intensive dairy situation, okay, where I've got a CAFO operation, and I'm basically taking the manure and I'm spreading it, like a lot of cows, and I'm spreading it on my soil. Okay? Look at the amounts of phosphorus in the surfaces of those soils. Okay? The first 2, the native and the pasture, the native, very low levels. The pasture, you can see a little bit of accumulation up at the surfaces, but the CAFO operation, where we're spreading that manure, huge jump. Well, that's not necessarily a problem, because I'm going to have calcium and or iron and aluminum depending on my pH in the soils, and most of that stuff's going to be bound up. And that's what we're looking at here. Okay? This is an increase in soil phosphorus level as we move up, okay? And this is time. And you'll see these steps here. These are basically, each one of these risers here is basically me going out there and dumping manure. Well, what's going to happen to that phosphorus that's in the manure? In all likelihood, it's going to be binding to the calcium if it's a high pH, or the iron and aluminum. But the question is, what happens right about here? This line basically here represents the P fixing capacity. It's the ability of the soil to fix, put in those inorganic pools into a form that are insoluble. So either the calcium pool or the iron and aluminum pool. Now the reality is these soils only have so much calcium and or iron and aluminum. You're going to reach a point right about here where the soils can't fix them anymore. We call this the P saturation level. P fixing capacity is met, at which point the soil is saturated with phosphorus. At that point, this line right here basically represents the phosphorus that's in the drainage water. The phosphorus that's leaving these soils through leaching. What happens at this point when you meet that fixing capacity? Huge increase in my phosphorus. The soils can't hold anymore because they don't have any more calcium and or iron and aluminum. Does that make sense? Yeah? Environmental consequence. Now the truth is, as this starts going up, I'm going to see more and more available for my crops, but there's a point at which it's going to be leaving the system. I cannot add any more. Go.
What time period is this over?
The time period, I mean, if we look at this, it looks like it's maybe 10 years, but the time period has to do with what this riser really is. How much manure, how much phosphorus I'm adding to the soil. Now there are ways of dealing with this, and many farms are now dealing with composting operations where they basically take this material and they ship it off somehow. Fessenden is a really good example of this, where they are composting their material and they basically sell it to greenhouse operations, to landscapers, to homeowners. Okay? In essence, they're thinking of this as another farm product. Dairy operations, what do they have? They have basically 2 products. They actually have 3 products. One is milk. right? That's their product. That's how, if you think about the budget of a farm, okay, stuff comes in, stuff goes out. What's leaving the farm? Milk. And that's the traditional farm operation. The newer farm operations are thinking, well, what else can I get off the farm? Because I have to get stuff on the farm to feed my animals. Okay, if I'm bringing in feed, that means I'm bringing in the phosphorus with that feed. Okay, and if I've reached this level, I can get rid of some of that in the milk. But I need to be able to get rid of more of it. So they're thinking of their manure, they're composting it, and they're selling it. Okay, what other source are on farms? What other product do farms have? What? Calves? Is that what somebody said? Well, yeah, I guess they do have calves. I wasn't thinking that. I was actually thinking urea or urine. Okay, they got liquid waste, they got solid waste, and solid waste is bedding as well as manure. Okay, and then they have liquid product, which is milk. And that's how they deal with this. If I can reduce that riser, it takes me a lot longer to get there. And if I increase my crops are going to be taking more of it out. Go.
Is the phosphorus in the drinking water, is that like all forms of it?
I don't have the correct answer for that one. I think it's pretty much all forms. But if it's all forms, you can certainly imagine if this is a phosphate form, if it moves down system, there's potentially material down there that it can bind with. But it's coming in as particulate matter as well as, and if this is near a stream, if my farm is way up in the hinterlands and there's no streams anywhere near, you can imagine that much of this P, if it's going in through groundwater, is going to go and be bound with calcium. But the minute this hits the stream, there's no calcium for it to bind with anymore, at which point it's gone. Go.
How do you manage salts in tropical rainforests? Because it's really acidic, and if you add like fertilizers, it's going to be destroyed.
Right, so the question is, if you're thinking about tropical systems where the soils are really acidic, okay, if you're adding phosphorus, where's it going to be going? Well, it's going to be going into this iron and aluminum bound. And that's where it gets into this issue. It becomes this. I'm adding fertilizer, what's going to happen to it? Well, most of it's going to be going here. The concept is you want to get some of it going that way. Okay, well, the problem is the amount of money that you're paying for this, you want to get more of this, and you don't want to get this leaving the system, and you don't want to get captured. So really, from a phosphorus management sense, you have basically two sources. One is this, and one is that. And which makes you think, well, I want to deal with how I can maximize this and minimize these. Now, maybe adding this, that could be on-site sourcing, but this also could potentially help you with your pHs. The thought is minimizing this, maximizing this. I really want to start thinking about pH management and some of the other strategies. Okay, and I will add, and this is somewhat controversial, but I will add, if you think about where we're mining our phosphorus, those mines are basically, Morocco, I think Wyoming, Florida, those mines are running out of phosphorus. Okay, we're going to be running into some serious issues with phosphorus fertilizer availability, which means this pool is going to this source is going to get more and more expensive, which means managing this and potentially adding this becomes more and more important. Go.
Why was it that phosphorus deficiency leads to create nitrogen fixation?
Right? So,
Because there's less plants growing to fix the nitrogen.
so P deficiency inhibits microbial N fixation. Well, if there isn't phosphorus, phosphorus is part of it's an enzymatic reaction that phosphorus is part of the enzyme that basically does the nitrogen fixation needs phosphorus. And so if there isn't any phosphorus, the microbial population that does the nitrogen fixation can't do it. It's not like the microbes are dead. It's they literally can't fix the nitrogen. Does that make sense? Yeah, I beyond that, I don't know enough about it. It's an enzymatic reaction. It's part of the protein, but other than that, I don't know. But Okay, any other questions? Do we feel comfortable with this so far? Okay, this took entirely more time than I thought I was going to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on potassium. Okay, we have 5 more minutes, and so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to break you guys up into groups, and we're going to be doing a connections game.